We can all hopefully agree that if you're gonna buy a pure 100% tablet, you're gonna buy an iPad no matter which one. But if you want a laptop and tablet combination, well, that's where an argument comes in. The brand new 2018 iPad Pros were officially released 3 days ago on November 7th, and it is a pretty big refresh. You got USB-C, you got Face ID, you got the A12X Bionic chip, but what matters is when you compare the iPad Pro to something else, and this is the Surface Pro 6. The Surface Pro 6 also got a slight refresh, but not many highlighting features. I mean, there's a new black color, but nothing much. And both the iPad Pro and the Surface Pro 6 are extremely comparable in price. If you get the keyboard and the stylus or pen, they all come out to around $1,100. So that completely begs the question, if you get the Surface Pro 6, which starts off at $900, get the Surface Pen, get the Surface Pro keyboard, compare that to the iPad Pro 11-inch, get the Apple Pencil Generation 2, and get the Smart Keyboard Folio, then they're very comparable in prices, which I've already said. So that begs the question, which one are you gonna buy? The Surface Pro 6 in a color black or the iPad Pro from 2018? And I'm here to argue that you're going to buy the iPad Pro 2018 for most people, for most use cases. The first category that we could talk about is the processor, and the iPad Pro kind of blows out the Surface Pro 6 in this regard. The Surface Pro 6 has an Intel i5 with 8 gigabytes of RAM, and the iPad Pro has 4 gigabytes of RAM, and the CPU is the A12X Bionic chip. And if you get the 1TB version, that has 6 gigabytes of RAM. But RAM doesn't matter too much. Apple's iOS 12 is very good at RAM management. Sure, it's always good to have that extra RAM, but you don't need that much. I don't think you need 8 gigabytes of RAM on an iPad Pro. 6, sure. If we just take a look at the Geekbench scores, the iPad Pro wins here with a multi-core score around 18,000, which is more than the base MacBook Air, more than the base MacBook, more than the base of the MacBook Pro. So if the A12X is more powerful than all those laptops, then you could imagine that it's more powerful than the Surface Pro 6, which has a multi-core score of only 13,000. So if you're gonna video edit, render 4K videos, or do Adobe Photoshop, which is gonna come to the iPad next year, the 11-inch or 12.9-inch iPad Pro is a clear winner in computing performance. One thing that gets dragged around is that iOS 12 is limiting. And honestly, it's not that limiting anymore. Now that the iPad Pro comes with USB-C, you could import your SD card or micro SD card, edit it on Adobe Rush or Lumix Fusion. The full version of Adobe Photoshop with zero limitations, the full version is coming to the iPad Pro next year in 2019. So you could do a lot of stuff. If you're a high school student or you're in college and you want to take some notes, you just get the Apple Pencil 2. And you could use the native app or just buy a $10 notes app, and you could be taking notes super easily with the Apple Pencil on the iPad Pro. It's a capable device. For the majority of the content creators on YouTube, you could just use an iPad Pro, use Lumix Fusion, and there you go. You have a full iPad tablet setup. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have Windows 10. This is really just a personal preference. Do you like Windows 10? And yes, the Surface Pro 6 could do some light video editing, but I don't think it's gonna do as good as the iPad Pro A12X Bionic chip. If you want performance and you trust in iOS 13, you gotta go with the iPad Pro, no doubt. Another category that is important in my mind is the ports that are supported by the device. Before this version of the iPad Pro, all it had was a lightning port and a headphone jack, but now it removed the headphone jack and it has USB-C. The Surface Pro 6, even though it was refreshed in 2018, doesn't have a USB-C port, which I'm gonna miss, and the way you charge the Surface Pro 6 is with its own proprietary connector, which if you cannot find that connector, you're gonna have to buy a full new one. With the iPad Pro, there's a good chance that your phone's USB-C or other things such as like a GoPro, other things that use USB-C, you could charge the exact same thing with your tablet or iPad Pro. The Surface Pro 6, since it doesn't have a USB-C port, it has the regular boring USB port, which I guess is still functional in 2018 since not everything's moving to USB-C. And it also has the headphone jack, and if you like are a DJ and need a headphone jack, well, I guess you gotta go with that. One thing that I have to mention that I almost forgot to say, the iPad Pro supports Microsoft Word as an app, Microsoft PowerPoint, Microsoft Excel, all the Google Cloud stuff, all those things you could do as a student. The iPad Pro overall isn't as limiting as people say. Sure it is, but hopefully with future software updates such as iOS 13, maybe 14, Apple is going to open up support a little bit more. And overall, if you're a student and your budget is $1,000 and you're deciding in between the Microsoft Surface Pro and the iPad Pro, how can you not choose the iPad Pro? What are the benefits with the Microsoft Surface Pro? The only thing you have is with a touchpad. And once you get used to not having that touchpad, your whole experience is going to be better because you have better speakers on the iPad Pro, you have better stylus support, you have a better camera on the iPad Pro which can record 4K at 60 frames per second. If you're into that, it has front-facing portrait mode and emoji future iOS updates. Sure, right now at the moment, the iPad Pro isn't a MacBook, but it's very comparable on what the tasks you could do with a Surface Pro. And let me just say from personal experience, that detachable keyboard on the Surface Pro is so annoying because those magnets aren't strong at all compared to the iPad Pro, which has tons of magnets, so that's never gonna come off. The last sentence that I want to give you to decide which one you should buy is that the iPad Pro is like a computer, but it's unlike any computer. Please like this video to share it with the world. Make sure you subscribe because I will see you tomorrow for the latest and greatest.